तरतः चार्थेष्वभिज्ञस्वराट् तेने ब्रह्महृदाय आदिकवये मुह्यन्ति यत्सूरयः तेजो वारिमृदां यथा विनिमयो यत्र त्रिसर्गो मृषा धाम्ना स्वेन सदा निरस्तकुहकं सत्यं परं धीमहि. Thank you. Translation: That from whom creation, sustenance, and dissolution of the universe takes place, who is both the instrumental and material cause of it, who is omniscient, is the only one having self-mastery, being the one independent entity, who illumined the mind of Brahma with the Vedic revelation, whose wisdom is the wonder of even the greatest sages, in whom the world of the three gunas subsists just as a combination of materials like fire, water, and earth subsist in their causes without changing their elemental nature, in whose consciousness there is nothing false. On that truth supreme we meditate. Okay. So the title of the talk is actually Gajendra Moksham. Actually, good evening, friends. Title of the talk is Gajendra Moksham, but the theme is based on self-surrender. So I'll be talking a little bit about self-surrender, then I'll be moving on to the story. What do we mean by self-surrender? What are we surrendering, and to whom are we surrendering? Something of those questions we can explore. In our current awareness, what we have as an experience is a dichotomy of I and not I, which we call as the world. And all those scriptures state that this awareness is based on false foundation of the fictitious, that I and world, the boundary, because when we try to pinpoint the boundary, we cannot really point it out. So that way it's actually unreal. But given that awareness, current awareness, it actually appears somewhat real that we have a feeling of I and not I. So with that current awareness, let's move ahead. So in this state of duality, so-called I and the not I, which is the world, we need to bring another entity called God, which is basically, because we see the multiplicity in the world, we need to have the process of the creation, preservation, destruction. So we bring some entity which overlooks all that process, we call it as God. Or if you are a little bit of analytical mind, you can think of the God as formless, and the very essence of this multiplicity that we see, the existence, knowledge, and bliss, that you can call as God. But in the devotional language, we will go with the usual description of God as a creator, preserver, and destroyer of what we see as this different entities in the world. Sorry, I think I clicked that. So the self-surrender process is something of the individuality that we have currently, that what we feel, is somehow to be obliterated, and that has to be risen higher so that we experience the God that we talk about, or at least hear about. So that's basically the process of self-surrender, and how we do it and all that. I'll be talking about a little bit more details later on, also at the end of the talk too, after the story is presented. So as a practice, self-surrender could be for us mostly is like, I am the doer. Currently we feel that I am the doer, but we need to transcend it to a feeling where God is the doer and I am the instrument. So that could be one of the process where we constantly remind ourselves of that fact, which is not a fact as of now, but at least it will hopefully descend into our horizon as a fact at some point. Also, it is recognizing and being aware that our present awareness as separate individuals, which in this state we are totally dependent on God as our inner indweller, inner controller, and so on. So these feelings have to become somewhat like a tangible experience rather than a theoretical knowledge. So that's kind of the progress we need to make, and self-surrender is a process that helps to get there. As one progresses in the practice of self-surrender, the awareness of the triad of the I, the world, and the God, also how their mutual relationship and how we feel about them, that also changes. It transforms. And ultimately, the end goal is, of course, the obliteration of this dichotomy of I and world, and only God exists. Self-surrender is generally practiced by many of us, actually unconsciously somewhat maybe. Like when we are in a relationship with a man or a woman, usually in the dating process, they are very submissive to the other person, trying to be in the good books of the other person. So that way they are kind of in a self-surrender mode. At the workplace, one submit oneself to, say, a boss or supervisor. In a family, maybe to a child, very young child. If you love the child very much, you probably sometimes yield to their wishes. Again, on a bigger scale, maybe leaders of the country or a teacher in the school and so on. So all these people we interact with, we do some kind of self-surrender, maybe not always or entirely, but to some extent we do practice that. However, with God, it is, and again, in these relationships, sometimes it's done as out of joy because we love the person, or sometimes more of a compulsion because of the working relationship that we want to maintain. But with God, it's a bit different because at present, God is not a very tangible entity, or tangible, if you want to give it a more of a personality, you can say tangible person, he or she, whomever you, personal God you want to follow. So that needs to be cultivated, some kind of a relationship, personal relationship. And again, devotional scriptures give us various methods. Think about God as a father, mother, or a child, or a beloved, and so on, or a master. So those kind of relationships need to be developed. And now, how to develop that relationship? One way would be, of course, constantly reminding yourself and feeling that, intensifying that feeling of that relationship. One way would be to actually read the excellences of God, or what we call as Leela, and Bhagavatam serves that purpose very well, and get that tangible feeling that God really is the entity that exists and also is overlooking us and helping the devotees in their path, removing the obstacles and so on. So that kind of feeling gets strengthened when we dwell on the excellences and the activities that have been done by God, maybe in the form of stories, but still they create a lasting impression on our mind, and create that feeling that God is something we need to, is God really exists, first of all, if we are still in the doubtful mode, but even then, and also becomes very tangible that he or she is actually helping us out when we try to improve ourselves devotionally or spiritually. So again, I was just putting this in the perspective where we, in the worldly sense, with the objects of senses, we always get easily attached to, at least some of us, not all maybe. Some of us get easily attached to the worldly sense of the sense object. Sorry. And I think in Bhagavad Gita we get the second chapter. I think 62nd verse, I guess. Dhyayato Vishayan Punsa Sangasteshu Pujayati. So even if the sense objects can attract us just by constantly remembering them and we get attached to them, the same way it applies to even God, in the sense of constantly remembering him or her and always thinking about their activity, his or her activities. We definitely cultivate devotion towards God. So that's one way of doing it. So just as it works in sense objects, it will work for the same for God too, the same practice. Most of us at least turn for, in terms of difficulties, to some physical entities. Say if you are if you have ill health, we go to a doctor, or maybe if you have some issue with some litigation, we go to a court or like a lawyer, so on. So we always look at some entities in this world. That's basically the way we deal with our problems in the world. But very rarely we look into the aspect of God that really helps us in these issues also. Of course, some people do go to God too for that, but even that's, I would say, a step more than what we usually do. So I was then thinking, okay, now how do we develop this relationship if we strengthen it to such an extent that we actually feel absence of God is very painful. Now that's kind of the very matured state we reach once we develop the relationship. Just like in any human relationship, if you have a very attracted or attached to one person, that person not being there or not being around, we feel very lonely or have kind of a very sorrowful feeling. So that can be overcome, of course, in the regular sense by attaching ourselves to God. And now that feeling of missing God, of course, is a very matured state and very in the spiritual progress, it's a pretty high state, which gopis had for Sri Krishna and various other devotees that we know of. Now that would be a real state to achieve, and once someone comes to that particular point, I think it's kind of the end of their self-effort, and it's now the God's turn to kind of reveal himself or herself at that point. So that's somewhat like in a short description, the journey that one can start from not having any tangible feeling of a God to very intense feeling of missing God at any moment, and feeling sorrowful about that when we miss that. So sometimes, of course, when we read Sri Ramakrishna's life, we come across his intense longing, and that should always make us ponder or at least pause and think that why are we not having that kind of intense longing and feelings, and what do we need to do to come to that point? I think Abhijit mentioned in the last class that his intensity was so strong that he was even prepared to give up his life. He picked up a sword and was about to cut his own throat for not having the vision of Divine Mother. But of course, things happen differently for him. But what I mean is, we don't feel that intensity as much as he did. Of course, he's a special person, but I'm just saying we need to get there somewhere, at least to that extent. So each one individually has to think about what he or she needs to do to come to that point. Of course, there's no fixed template for everyone to follow. I mean, there's general guidance, of course, to have dispassion and cultivate more devotion and all that practices. But how you implement it in your own life is, of course, the details that need to be worked out by each individual, himself or herself. So as long as we are busy with the things of this world, of course, that strong longing may not arise. So that's one thing we can do proactively, is to, in the negative sense, cut as much as possible the attachments and hankering or the cravings for those sense objects that we crave for, or it could be even human relationships or anything else that may attract our attention very strongly and intensely. For a few souls, fortunately, or maybe because of their past births or anything, they are kind of born with it. The intense longing for God is innate and natural, and probably from the childhood itself. For most of us, at least, it is a process, and we need to cultivate it. We need to put effort. It doesn't come naturally, at least. And unfortunately or fortunately, you can say that most of us cultivate that devotion only through misery. And I think Swamiji mentioned that in previous classes, how Kunti prayed to Lord that the only way they can think of God is through intense misery and difficulties. So, considering the current situation of virus, maybe we should be prayerful at this point, thinking that God should help us. That way can be probably devotion will increase. So that's one way to see it. We dream of many things to be achieved. Maybe we plan for a day of what we'll do tomorrow, or maybe next moment, or maybe few weeks down the line, or months, or years. Who knows? We kind of have some vague idea, or it's something we want to do. We plan it out. But in this current state where suppose we don't feel that intense longing for God, do we factor in how or what God actually has a plan for us? If at all that there is such a plan, but considering that God is all knower and all that, obviously there may be some plan for us that He made, and which we think we should be following. Now this is where the self-effort and God's will or individual will and all that, that kind of I would say debate or kind of an argument comes in, where we'll say how much is the individual will and how much is God's will that's coming to play. We'll talk about that a little bit detail after the story. I have something more to talk about that, but for now, uh, I feel sometimes that if we really feel the tangible presence of God, at the same moment we should also be worried to some extent that whatever I've been doing or whatever I'll be doing in future, is that something that would align our a path with what has God has planned for it, or planned for us, and so on. Some may think, of course, if you are totally truly devotional to God, God will take care of you in any respect. That's a different story. But since we are not there yet, at least many of us, so we should always be at least having a kind of a pause or a momentary introspection, thinking that the steps that I'm taking, the decisions I'm making, is that something that would be helpful for my spiritual progress and growth, and would of course, if you are very sincere, God may help you out in that process too, but that's something at least I feel sometimes we need to ponder. And self-surrender, actually what it does is the intense longing or that we have for some event to happen. Maybe we want a different president for next election. Maybe that's something some people have very intense longing. And someone may have something else. I'm just giving an example. So all that strong longing and intense craving, maybe they will get reduced, and hopefully we'll be more intensely thinking about what my life purpose is and what would I do with it, and how will I approach God. So maybe our energy should be devoted more towards that front. That's what my suggestion is. So I thought here a quote by Swami Vivekananda. Okay, I think I'm not following the slides. So anyway, I think I just described them in the same in details, but you see kind of a pictorial presentation there with some kind of the gist or summary. So the current experiences of the I and the world, and self-surrender is a process which takes us to God. The normal practice is, of course, as I was saying, it's either self-surrender is either through love or compulsion, and the process is, again, you develop a relationship with God, and that can be developed again through remembering God always, or his or her excellences and activities, which is called Leela Dhyana, which was mentioned by Abhijit also last time. And again, eagerness to be with God intensifies as we move along. So that's kind of a progress, if you can say. Remembering God and relationship with God intensifies, and then eagerness to be with God, and sorrow when we don't have any vision or we miss the presence of God. And ultimately, maybe the goal is to be in the company of God always. So here I just thought a quote from Swami Vivekananda is somewhat apt, because as I was mentioning, we always dream about things that we want to do in future. So I'll just read this. Every child is a born optimist. He dreams golden dreams. In youth, he becomes still more optimistic. It is hard for a young man to believe that there is such a thing as death, such a thing as defeat or degradation. Old age comes and life is a mass of ruins. Dreams have vanished into the air, and the man becomes a pessimist. Thus we go from one extreme to another, buffeted by nature, without knowing where we are going. It reminds me of a celebrated song in the Lalita Vistara, the biography of Buddha. Buddha was born, says the book, as a savior of mankind, but he forgot himself in the luxuries of his palace. Some angels came and sang a song to rouse him, and the burden of the whole song is that we are floating down the river of life, which is continually changing with no stop and no rest. So are our lives, going on and on without knowing any rest. Thus we are oscillating between optimism and pessimism. So this one, the quote from Swami Vivekananda somehow, of course it's trying to bring a balance, but also the question may arise that should we not have any aspirations or dreams in life? Many times these dreams and aspirations that we plan out or dream about actually motivate us to work. So having these dreams or aspirations itself by themselves it's not wrong, but only thing is that whether we are totally enamored by it, whether we think that's the only goal in life, those are the troubling factors. And when we don't achieve them, are we in an equanimity or mind of equanimity where we take it in our stride? So those are the things that we need to be particular about. Of course, there are again goals and aspirations which may not help in the spiritual progress, so that one needs to be cautious about. But those that are for one's subsistence and livelihood, and things like if one has a family, of course, there's something needs to be done about that, and so on. But ultimately, there comes a stage where even those considerations fall off. But that's at a stage where of a very high spiritual state. But for now, one has to be cautious of those dreams and aspirations that we have, and be choosy, and particularly see that they don't harm our spiritual progress or the path that we are treading upon. As I was saying, ultimately the God is the one who takes care of the devotees. And again, from chapter 9, verse 22, I think I quoted even last talk, but I always like that. That's kind of one of my favorites, you can say. There are those who always think of me and engage in exclusive devotion to me. To them, whose minds are always absorbed in me, I provide what they lack and preserve what they already possess. Again, this is a very great assurance from Lord, saying that he or she will take care of you if you are very devoted to him or her. And again, take care in the sense, not that you will not get any diseases or anything, but take care in the sense of very holistic way, rather, in a very spiritual and devotional sense. The one who is practicing self-surrender. Okay, so there are two parables I would like to talk about, and then I'll move on to the story. I think we'll be again running out of time already. The two parables are Sri Krishna talking about a baby monkey and a kitten, where the baby monkey holds on to the mother cat always with all its, mother monkey with all its strength. Whereas the kitten is always resigned to the mother cat. Like kitten always mews, and mother cat moves the kitten wherever it needs to be going. So it's completely self-surrendered and resigned to mother cat, whereas the baby monkey has to hold on to the mother with all its strength. So this is kind of two approaches, and one I would say is more matured in the sense like the kitten, where the kitten doesn't even feel any need to express its individuality and effort, which is like probably like a goal, you can say, whereas most of us, at least, are the baby monkeys trying our best with all our effort. Similarly, he talks about another parable, I think the father carrying a baby in arms and another toddler walking with holding his hand. Again, the same thing, the child is holding the hand of the father, so he or she has to be careful, always holding the father's hand, lest he or she can fall, whereas the one who is being held by the father in the arms is always taken care of. So kind of both are similar analogies. Okay, with that, so what I said was that one needs to transcend from the baby monkey to kitten, or from the child to that baby in arms as we progress along. So moving on to the story now, actual story, the theme of this the story of Gajendra Moksham. So this one is actually, what it literally means is salvation of the lordly elephant by name Gajendra. Now this story appears in Skanda 8 of Srimad Bhagavatam book. It's one of the very popular stories in India. Almost everyone knows about it. They have heard in childhood. Basically talks about the self-surrender that I was talking about earlier. Again, now just bringing the story details here, recall that there are two levels of narration in Bhagavatam at least. Sometimes they go more than two levels. But in this stage, there are only two levels, which is the Parikshit and Shukadeva. They are talking to each other, having conversation. And Suta, Romaharshana and sages in Naimisaranya forest, they were also conversing. Suta was actually present when Shukadeva was narrating Bhagavatam to Parikshit. He heard that, and now he is passing that to the sages in the Naimisaranya forest. You see these two narrations interspersed in Bhagavatam very often. So here in this Manmantra is a specific age of time. I won't go into the details. In this specific age, Lord incarnated as Hari, he's called Hari in this, to a couple by name Mother Harini and Father Harimedhas. And this incarnation Hari actually saves the elephant from further. I'll not describe the details of the story, but the elephant will be saved by the Lord eventually in this story. Sage Sukha adds that this incarnation of Lord Hari releases the elephant from the crocodile's jaws. So the elephant was caught in the crocodile's jaws, and Lord helps the elephant to come out of it. Parikshit then requests the sage Sukha to explain the story, making it clear that he would like to listen to this story only due to the presence of the Lord in it. So that's like a devotee. A devotee is always interested in only listening to the God and not any other kind of gossip or frivolous talk. which Sri Ramakrishna also alludes to very often in gospel. When one is very devoted, anything else besides God hurts. So the quote he says is, among descriptions of men, this is from the book Srimad Bhagavatam, said by Parikshit, among descriptions of men and things, those wherein the Lord of holy fame is extolled are the most attractive, sanctifying, rewarding, and auspicious. And also Sri Shuka, it's mentioned here in the book that prompted in this way by Parikshit to expound the glorious deeds of the Lord, Sri Shuka said joyously as follows in that assembly of sages. So again, both the Parikshit and Shukadeva are very happy to talk about God. So that's kind of being alluded to or described in this book, in these words. Other thing I always like to pay attention to is, we can take any book we want to, but we need to be mentally prepared also to understand what's being told. Of course, understand again not just by meaning or words, but also to get the benefit really is actually trying to be in the state of mind of the main protagonist, or if it's probably a sage giving those words, maybe trying to be in that state of mind if possible, of course, as much as we can. So that's something one needs to strive. So there's any book, especially I would say, but this nothing to do only with scriptural book. It could be even any novel. When I was a child, I used to read so many of those classic novels like Kidnapped or Treasure Island. Robinson Crusoe was one of my favorite. And you always get transported to that world. You basically are almost like you are the person who is going through that process. At least as a child, that was very vivid imagination that we can have. Maybe as adults, sometimes we lose that imagination or we think that's too silly. But maybe in the scriptural books, it's much more helpful to develop or keep that attitude and develop more if you can. So here also I was thinking the Parikshit state is a very unique. It's basically he's about to pass away. He has only 7 days left. Has been cursed by a snake. Cursed by a Brahmin boy that he'll be killed by a snake. Now what does he do? He actually is like normally what would we do? That I thought we should also ponder ourselves. What would we do if you are told that you have only 7 days? That's a very relevant question, and we need to maybe think about what would be our topmost thing that we would like to do in that 7 days. For Parikshit, as a devotee he was thinking about God, and things so happened that Sri Sukha also came there, and you had a wonderful narration of Srimad Bhagavatam for the benefit of not only himself, but everyone around and also ages down the line like us. But I was thinking, what would we be doing? At least what would I be doing personally, of course. Would I go and meet some family friends, someone whom I haven't met for a long time, maybe, or go for some adventure or things like that? So people have their own choices to make. So it depends on what you would like to do, but it's something we need to ponder and think what would be our topmost thing to do, and maybe we have to reevaluate if things are maybe not what we would like them to be. So something that we can check ourselves. Again, I thought that would be nice context here for Shankaracharya's that verse from Bhajagovindam, which says life is like a water droplet on the leaf of the lotus leaf, unsteady and prone to drop off any time. So even if you may think that, well, I'm not in Parikshit's state anyway, I have probably a few years or maybe more, whatever. We never know. It may not even be 7 days. It could be even the next moment. So better be prepared for whatever. Again, I think I have probably some time, maybe, I don't know. I want to skip this, but these are more like quotes and context, giving some context to it. So this is just, first one is more like a story, actually. A poor Brahmin approached Yudhishthira, the emperor of Indraprastha, the Pandavas, the oldest of the Pandavas, for financial help. But being busy at the moment, Yudhishthira asked the Brahmin to come the next day. Hearing this, his brother Bhima, the second one in the Pandavas lineage, the order of brothers, began celebrating by playing trumpet with great joy. Yudhishthira, perplexed, asked his brother what the occasion was, and that made him so happy. Bhima replies that he was extremely happy that his brother was assured of living till the next day in this ephemeral world, as he postponed the noble act of giving alms for the next day. Yudhishthira realized his folly and called the Brahmin back and to donate the alms very then. at that moment. So this is again, it may not have been a true incident, at least described in Mahabharata, I'm not sure, but it conveys the point that even the next day assurance itself is a false one. We shouldn't be having that kind of assurance. This is again a quote from J.P. Vaswani, a spiritual teacher. I will skip this, but again talks about the similar line that we assume or we take it for granted the life is extended version for some years, but it can happen. The death can come in any moment. Okay, with that I will proceed further. So now what you see is a picture of an elephant there. So the story begins this way. How it basically describes the forest where the elephant was residing. So I'll just describe few lines. O king, there was a famous mountain. This is Sri Shuka narrating it to Parikshit. O king, there was a famous mountain called Trikuta with 3 peaks, profuse with minerals that caused it to glitter. It stood as an ornament to all quarters with its precious stones and metals and abundance of various trees and creepers, and with its waterfalls spreading their sound on all sides. It had various caves that were used by celestial beings for their sport. Now, I spent some little time in describing this, which may look mundane for some of us or all of us maybe, but there is a reason, but I will probably go ahead and we'll talk about it later. The sage here, the Sri Shuka, further describes, I just put only the few lines here. Actually, it's not mentioned in the slide, but I just read it out. These are only few lines, but there are, you can think of another maybe 30, 40 lines like this, which detailedly describe about all the forests, the trees, the flowers, the birds, the mountains, all that, the scenery basically. So all that is detailedly described in the book. And one may ask, of course, I was saying, why? Why do we need to know all this in great detail? Why can't we straight away go to the topic? At least, what's the point? So, as I think Abhijit again mentioned last class, this is more like a Leela Dhyana. So you think about the scenery, you get transported to that world, it becomes more tangible and realistic at that point. And now, of course, anything that happens in that world, which is very realistic at that point, even God, when he appears, he or she appears, it becomes realistic for you. So that way, it creates a sense of realism of God, and that's very helpful. And that's because of that's kind of called the Leela Dhyana, or meditation on the activities of Lord. The other thing could be, it's a very symbolic one. So you can think about these as some kind of analogies that you can draw to some, so actually Lord himself mentions all these details of at the end of the story of Gajendra Moksham, Lord himself mentions how one should meditate on all these aspects that has been mentioned, the scenery, like the forest, the hills and water, the lake, and so on. All that in detail, he describes how it should be meditated upon as his own form. So he kind of says the mountains are like the arm, I'm not sure, I don't want to put it in an incorrect way, but it will be like something like that. His arms are something like a mountain, maybe, if you want to put that way, and his hair is something, his eyes are something. So every gross form that you see of the scenery is related to Lord, so that you can meditate upon. So you can take it as a symbolism, or you can take it as a Leela Dhyana. When Lord appears, it's all that like a real world that happened, and you are kind of transported to that and get benefit of it. So in this forest, where there's an elephant herd led by a male, alpha male you can say, and that's the name is Gajendra, and he had a group of female elephants and young ones. Now, of course, typically elephant herds are actually not led by males. They're usually matriarchal in nature. So there's usually an adult female, like the one who is the leader of the group, and there are a bunch of females, and they all take care of the young ones. So males usually they grow up with this herd, and once they become mature, they wander around themselves. They are kicked out of the group. But for the purpose of the story, let's go ahead with that. This is, of course, not in that sense, need not be very factual in that, but it's more of a, the benefit is more out of what we learn from it, is that's more important. So now the other question is, why is elephant is the main character in this? That's because elephant is generally seen as, at least the male elephant, I guess, like any other species maybe, are seen as very egoistic. So that's one of the representation. So any egoistic person or a personality is being represented as a elephant in this story. So there's Bhartruhari's Niti Shatakam, one of the verses. When I knew but a little, I was blinded by pride as an elephant is blinded by rut from excitement, and my mind was puffed up with the idea that I knew everything. When, however, I gradually gained knowledge through the contact of the wise, I found I was a fool, and the pride which had possessed me like a fever left me. So this story is actually on very similar lines, and also this is the kind of a lesson that we need to learn from that story. The elephant in this story is a representative of every human who thinks I am an individual endowed with certain powers and I can do what I can with those powers. So in other words, the very idea of this individuality is being shown, or as a representative of this, is the elephant in this story. And also there is something more about the male elephants in general. They have this secretion that happens when they are in reproductive, seasonal in nature. Hormones get secreted and they become very agitated. They cannot be controlled. In the sense they become very violent also sometimes, leading to deaths and so on. So again, this young male elephant is being shown that way as a representation again of a human person, or a human being who is very much attached to all these sense objects of the world, is craving for them intensely, and anyone who obstructs it, the person gets very agitated, angry, and so on. Again, this is very typical. It's mentioned even in the Bhagavad Gita, the same verse I was quoting earlier, where if the desires are thwarted by someone or something, we get very angry towards that. That's because of our attachment to those sense objects. So the elephant actually kind of represents our state when we are totally attached to sense objects. The elephant, to quench its thirst and along with this herd, goes into the lake, and there now, of course, it gets caught by the crocodile. So deluded by Lord's Maya, he was unaware, like a pitiable and foolish family man, of the imminent danger lurking. As he bathed and fed the cows and calves with the water he drew in his trunk. O king, as providence would have it, he found all of a sudden that his food was in the grip of an infuriated crocodile stronger than himself. Now again, this is somewhat representative of our human society in general. Most of us are very much busy with our family and other kith and kin, our friends, or other possessions and other things, not just necessarily any human relationships. So the Gajendra here is something very similar. It's totally engaged in all these activities as a worldly person is usually totally engaged in or engrossed in. And but the thing is, the elephant could have been happily on the land itself and probably not get into any trouble whatsoever. But now because of the thirst, now again this thirst is symbolic here. The thirst of the elephant, of course, thirst for water, but it also means thirst for generally what we see as a thirst for sense objects or for some kind of fulfillment in this world, where we look for the objects to possess the objects and get that fulfillment. So that kind of feeling is being represented as thirst by the elephant. So it's a kind of an analogy that we need to draw between what's happening with the story and what maybe a human person or the person's life is in general, and that's kind of the parallel we need to draw. Also, it's described here that the elephant was full of pride, and all these other animals were afraid of it to approach, and they move away whenever the elephant approaches. Same way that when someone is possessed of intense desire, then he or she almost becomes kind of unapproachable in a way. That's kind of putting it very mildly. Sometimes it could be even person could be very dangerous also. So that kind of feeling is being depicted by the other animals towards that male elephant. And this elephant now is totally in its own pride, involved in its mundane activities and not thinking about anything higher. And this is kind of a normal life of most of the ordinary people that in the society. At this point, I want to kind of present a little bit different from this person. She's actually Aya Kito. She is from Japan, 1960s, sometime back. She was detected by a disease which is spinocerebellar disease, ataxia, that's the technical name. But what it does is basically, over a period of time, say a few years, 5 or 10 years or so, you slowly lose the control of your limbs, of your talking and walking and eating and all that. So it's basically a degradation in your life, basically in the quality of life. And it's such a painful one because your mind is still active, you're conscious. You're like almost like becoming a vegetable, but not immediately. It's a progressive one, progressive decline. And her struggles are well recorded through her diary. She maintained a diary and she wrote her thoughts and everything in that. It's what I felt inspiring from those, from her thoughts and words, were that she says at one point, people take their lives for granted, most of them. Are even simple things like moving a finger or lifting a hand or things like that, which were so difficult for her, I mean, probably impossible at some stage of her disease, we take it for granted. And that's something she was wondering, how can people take it so much for granted, all that life and all that control, that so-called control that we have on our body. So I thought that was a bit amazing that we take things for granted, even in the mundane sense of our body and all that, and we get so much involved with it. But what she found was the body was not under her control. Basically, she's not even the body, because she's trying to control the body. She's fighting that every day, every moment to get some control. So in a way, she was treating the body as an object. So that kind of state, I would say it's some kind of maturity as if you say in the spiritual progress, we need to at least treat the body as an object mentally. But that came to her somewhat naturally, but of course through some unfortunate circumstances, if you want to put it that way. Two particular quotes I liked from her diary, and of course the diary is very famous. 18 million copies got sold, and it's an inspiration for many people who are suffering lifelong diseases, and also for regular people like us, not to take life for granted and be thankful for what we have, and also, of course, treat the body as an object as supposed to be. But at the same time, of course, not torture it and all that, but treat it as supposed to be. I really don't want to say things such as, I want to go back as how things were done. I recognize how I am right now, and I will continue to live on. She was saying this in her state of terrible debilitation. Even in that state, she could utter those words or have those thoughts. I thought that was remarkable. And then again, she says another one is, death is not fearful. What's fearful is giving up. So that's kind of inspiration I thought was nice to have. I brought this in the context that the elephant was in that kind of state where it takes things for granted. There's nothing awareness of anything higher than this body and mind, and also the immediate family that it has, and all the luxuries, so-called luxuries at least, of the forest and other fruits and other things that it's getting from the forest. So it's like any person who is totally involved in the world, having a good family, possessions, and enjoying life, so-called. That's kind of the representation of that elephant. But now it got into a situation where it's kind of helpless and is having a terrible suffering. Okay. So that's the elephant's helplessness. That's again the quote from the book, Srimad Bhagavatam. I think that's probably, I'm going a bit ahead. Actually, there's another quote, I didn't put that on the slide. The powerful elephant tried as best as he could to release himself from its hold, the crocodile's hold. As the exhausted elephant king was thus pulled away by that strong crocodile, the cow elephant stood crying loudly in distress, while the males tried their best to save him, but with no success. Again, this is very similar to a human being's life, where he or she, who are totally been thinking that this family and this people around and all these possessions are the only thing in the world that one needs to have, and these are the supports that are helping me out always. But at the moment of death or difficulty, they're of no use. They really didn't make any difference. They were helpless themselves, just as this person or Gajendra or any human being would be helpless when death comes. So both of them are in a way helpless situations, and they need to, and so what would help this person who is in that state where death is imminent, and now what he or she would be doing at that moment. So again, I put Swami Vivekananda's quote here, God helps those who don't help themselves. So the idea is, when we had all these physical props of these relationships and possessions and all that, we were not thinking about God so much, or as much as we should. But when they are taken away, or at least when they are helpless in the dangerous situations that we face, then maybe our attention may turn to God. So some of us probably have to go through a very terrible situations to come to that state. I'm not praying that we should, but if it happens, maybe we should take it in our stride. So that would be helpful in that situation. So this is a picture actually that was sent to me by one of our friends on WhatsApp, and I found that was very telling, which is actually here the elephant is there too, but probably not part of the story anyway. So the man is very greedy and eagerly looking for the some kind of worldly enjoyment, so-called, from that honey that drips from the hive, and is very desperate for that. And at the same time, the supports that he is holding upon, like you can say now family or possessions and all that, they will be taken away eventually. And they are like, there's snakes that are waiting down, there's rats that are, or something that's eating away the branch, and the elephant is trying to break the tree. But the person is very busy still trying to look for that enjoyment that he or she gets from the hive, which is like the world. And God is offering the help, and he or she is not taking it at that point. So maybe when he or she is about to fall down or something, perhaps that's the moment when maybe he or she will take the hand. Now in this case, the Gajendra did the same thing. Now he is so helpless, no one is of help around, so he went into he actually started praying to God. So this is I think I mentioned this one, the tug of the war. So there was actually a fight, again, as Puranas or the scriptures usually have kind of exaggerate, you can say, maybe the thousands of years there was a fight between these two, the crocodile and the elephant. And but the crocodile was powerful because it was in the water, and the elephant was not so, was helpless and couldn't help himself getting out of that crocodile's grip. So what he did was so he thought, now these sorrowing friends, it's in the middle of the quote, these sorrowing friends are not able to help me. The cow elephants are still more helpless. Though I am in the grip of this crocodile, the stranglehold of destiny, I take shelter in him, the Lord, he who gives shelter to all who seek refuge in him from the fear of the powerful serpent of death that is irresistibly encircling them. He for fear of whom even death operates on all, in him I seek refuge. So this is the thought that elephant gets at that moment, because everything else that it had depended upon till then were all useless. Okay, I think I will go ahead with this parable. This parable again shows that God helps people who are not eagerly taking care of themselves in a way. So this is the parable where once Lakshmi and Narayana again were seated in Vaikuntha. When Narayana suddenly stood up, Lakshmi had been stroking his feet. She said, "Lord, where are you going?" Narayana answered, "One of my devotees is in great danger. I must save him." With these words, he went out, but he came back immediately. Lakshmi said, "Lord, why have you returned so soon?" Narayana smiled and said, "The devotee was going along the road overwhelmed with love for me. Some washermen were drying clothes on the grass, and the devotee walked over the clothes. At this, the washermen chased him and were going to beat him with their sticks. So I ran out to protect him." "But why have you come back?" asked Lakshmi. Narayana laughed and said, "I saw the devotee himself picking up a brick to throw at them. So I came back." So what this says is, when we try to solve the worldly issues in the worldly sense, from what we understand, they may get resolved, but at the same time we are paying some price in not depending on God and not trying to cultivate a devotion on God. So that's something I feel maybe we need to think. Even if there's a worldly solution, like here probably the devotee took matter in his own hands, and of course he resolved the issue to some extent himself. But maybe Lord would have helped him out in a better way, or he would have got probably vision of Lord, things like that. So the self-surrender was not completely there or mature in that devotee yet, at least up to the point. So that's something I guess one needs to think when we also try to fix issues ourselves. Most of the times, of course, there are things that we need to do, I guess, but we always have to keep that in the back of mind that we are not there yet, where we totally are surrendered to God. Okay. The next one is elephant's prayer. So now this is the Gajendra Stotram. Now the elephant actually goes into an effusive prayer for the Lord. Okay, it's 827. Um, the prayer is a very, of course, very devotional. It actually has a lot of impersonal aspects and also very personal aspect of how the elephant is feeling at that point and what it wants to convey to Lord. So I put some excerpts of that prayer. There are actually 29 verses. What I have is only 3 of them there. I will skip to the third one. What I would say here is, it basically says, I have no desire looks like, okay, I have no desire to live on in this world. Of what use is life in this elephant body, wherein the veils of ignorance hide the spiritual vision, both from within and without? It is not from crocodile threatening my life that I pray for release, but from obstructive screen of ignorance, an obstructive screen that time cannot undo, but only illumination can. For time will put an end to this physical body, but not ignorance, which persists until thy grace removes it. So here, I think this is a kind of the elephant began the prayer with, of course, the misery, and the immediate attention was that to get relief from the crocodile. But at some point, it grew in devotion during the process of singing a hymn to the Lord. And now it says it doesn't even care whether it will get released or not. All it wants is to be freed from ignorance, to have the vision of Lord and be with Him always. That's what the elephant is praying for. That's a remarkable change. Even that painful situation, the elephant was actually thinking about that scenario, or wants it to be more of an illumination rather than a physical release. There's actually a hint, I missed that point. The Sri Shukadeva says that the prayer began to utter the great mantra before the stotra, before it started the prayer, that he had practiced in previous births. So that was mentioned in the book. So that shows that actually the elephant was a devotee at some point in the previous births, and for some reason now it is in the body of an elephant. So it has now continued that devotional attitude in this particular body at this point, and it came out only because of some great difficulty that he was facing. So sometimes maybe whatever innate or inherent devotional attitude you might have in the previous life that you have cultivated, maybe that will come out if some great difficulty comes across. So sometimes we have to treat great difficulties and miseries probably as a blessing. And more likely, I think I would say always, but if we cannot see it that way, at least we should try to see it. Okay, the Lord's appearance. Lord Hari approached there in his eagle vehicle. Again, that's the eagle there is a picture from Wikipedia. Seeing the Lord there, Gajendra offered his worship by lifting his trunk with a lotus in it, saying, O Narayana, teacher of all, O Bhagavan, thou endowed with all powers and excellences, salutations. So, and then it offers Lord the flower, and the elephant is released. Lord takes both of them out of the water. He cuts the neck of the crocodile, or head of the crocodile, you can say. And the crocodile actually was also released from its body. The crocodile was in the past Gandharva, a celestial being, and it was released by now Lord's intervention, and it regains its old form and it goes away back to its abode. So even the crocodile was released in that sense from the physical bondage of this crocodile, but of course it went into its own world, what it was supposed to be doing. Whereas the elephant was actually a devotee, unlike a crocodile. So elephant actually got the liberation or the moksha that he was looking for. So that's kind of the conclusion of the story. And elephant's past life was that it basically was a king. They actually specifically mention a Pandya king called Indrajumna. So he was a devotee. Once he was in a forest, and he was actually became a meditative ascetic at that point, and he was in meditation, but sage Agastya approached there with his retinue, and he didn't pay attention. So this is very similar to the original story of Parikshit and the other sage that we heard, where Parikshit was cursed. But now it's a bit reversed. The king is actually meditating, and sage Agastya approached there, and the sage was not paid proper attention. The sage cursed him that he will become an elephant in the next birth, which is what happened in this case. And Indrajumna took it well. He took it as a destiny or the god's gift, and he became an elephant. But he didn't remember it in the initial stages of his life. Until the difficulty came, he recalled his previous devotional tendencies. Okay, I think I'm running out of time, but I thought I could. I thought of developing some phenomenological model here, but looks like I won't have time for it. So I think I'll skip that portion. I created some explanation for all this, but I think I'll go ahead and skip that portion. This is based on these two quotes. Basically, what I'm trying to show is that universal consciousness, which is shown as a plane there, that plane is infinite, but for understanding purpose, I drew a finite boundary as a rectangle. And then you have that ego, which is a point. Again, instead of a point, I put a circle, again for representation purpose. And these cones are basically like you can say an individual with all the ego package. Ego throwing out all its, with the gross body and thoughts, emotions, and all that as a representation. And then when the ego basically, there's a dynamism in that ego sense, if you want to put that way, where you will see the things are like, varying. And also there's another individual that you interact with, suppose, and those are like interactive cones. Again, this is borrowing something from our 15th chapter in Bhagavad Gita, where the Ashwatha tree is represented as that form. You can, instead of a tree, you can think of as a cone, coming from like an inverted cone. And the quotes are again relevant here from Ramanuja's, Swami Vivekananda's interpretation of Ramanuja's philosophy, where he says the soul is like expanding and contracting continuously based on the selfishness or selflessness they profess. And then the yoga, this is Patanjali's, where it says that yoga is basically negating the chitta's modifications, or the mind stuff's modifications. So that's kind of a dynamism, you can say. We need to negate as much as we can. That's the practice we need to. And then I put some stages of self-surrender. The main thing about self-surrender is, again, I was alluding to that earlier too, that at the end I'll mention some things about it. Again, I guess we ran out of time, so I will skip that in details. But what I said was self-surrender is something we need to practice. It comes only through self-control. So the less we assert our individuality and our I, the more the self-surrender manifests itself. Though that's kind of the goal. So it's like a renunciation, you can say, in the knowledge path, if you want to put that way. Or you can say in the devotional sense, you cultivate more and more devotion to God. That way you don't assert your own individuality and ego as much as you should, or as much as we are doing. So there are multiple stages. I just put, first one is like basic one, where there's no self-control at all and we act impulsively. The practice would be we all try to offer the fruits to God and do action with no hankering for results. Again, two relevant quotes. One is more of an impersonal in the nature, like you kind of do actions without any hankering for results. But chapter 12, so is more like a devotional one from Bhakti Yoga, where it says you can offer the fruits of your actions to God. The next one, I'm sorry, I'm going another way. Stage 2, where you have some sense of self-control. Again, we act impulsively, but most of the times, maybe not always. Again, the same process, we just have to strengthen that. And again, relevant quotes are same from the Bhagavad Gita, two verses there. And the stage 3, here, this is something you have almost established yourself in the self-control, but again, the desires are still active. So that means there's a good sense of willpower that we developed. Actually, I didn't introduce the topic of willpower. In that phenomenological model that I was talking about, I was thinking about talking about willpower more there, but we didn't have time to dwell on that. So the willpower that is inherent in us, which is actually God's willpower, you can say, but it manifests through us as our own individual willpower in our state of individualization. But through willpower, we can somehow control most of our innate desires. We have exhibit perfect self-control, but we still have the craving for those sense objects. And again, the top verses that come in handy in practice are chapter 12, verse 9, and then from chapter 2, verse 59, which describes that even though we may restrain ourselves, we still have some craving for the sense objects. Okay, and the last stage is basically one has perfect self-control. There's also no real strong desires for God. And at this point, I think someone is just waiting for either God revelation or maybe almost there. I mean, this is a state where the devotee or all the self effort that needs to be done has been done. Now it's only from the other side, things have to be revealed at that right moment. So that's kind of a patient waiting in a way. You can say maybe Shabari is of that type when she was waiting for Rama to come, things like that. So there's again 2 verses from chapter 12 and 2. So chapter 2 is dealing mostly with the impersonal aspect, you can say, and 12 is more of the personal God aspect. So that kind of parallels between 2 chapters. I think we ran out of time already, so I think with that I'll close this. Thank you for your patience, and thank you, Swamiji, for giving the opportunity. And that's about it. Any questions? I actually had a plan to play some song, but I think we ran out of time for that. So thank you. If you have any questions, yeah.
I had a comment. It is true that misery can bring you closer to God. But what I've found is that in nature, there are some times where you just go, oh my God, and you're no longer, you're just molecules or atoms moving through other atoms. And it's rather amazing to be in that state. And it's anything but misery. But misery, oh, I've been there. Oh, I have.
Probably you came to that state where through misery, probably.
I think I had enough.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, misery is always a teacher, one way or the other. Either we get forbearance.
Bliss.
I mean, some people, of course, there are people who I have seen personally also that misery comes to them and they think, where is God? I don't believe in God anymore. So that's the negative thing can occur, and have seen people of that type too. But I would say if they're sincere enough, God will again take care of them too in one way or the other. So thank you. Closing prayer. Okay, I don't have a closing prayer. I was planning to go for the song, so but I think I will do the general prayer. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. I don't think we have any announcements, but I think this Sunday is Swami Sarvapayan's talk. I don't think that needs an announcement anyway. People know, I guess. The topic is the Atman, a philosophical meditation by Swami Sarvapayanji on Sunday. And Tuesday is by Sukalyan Sen Gupta, I think, that on one of the Swami, I think Swami Shivanand on Tuesday.